They've got some money. They're going to go out and get a solution. They know nothing about the technology, but they see a fancy demo and they're impressed by it and they spend their money. And then we see the demo by the same people and we go through it and start asking questions and find out that it's not quite what they say it is.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 172. How can Counter UAS measures be used to enhance security and public safety efforts? For that question, we turn to someone who is uniquely qualified to give us the answers. Brian Fentiman is Vice President and CTO of Blueforce UAV Consulting, a Canadian-based UAS, Counter UAS consulting and training company. Blueforce assists in building unique UAS and Counter UAS programs for enterprises of any size. Brian recently retired from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police after 34 years of service. He has spent the last 3 years building the UAS and Counter UAS program for that organization in British Columbia. He is a technical expert on UAS electronic countermeasures and holds a Diploma in Telecommunications. He maintains a Part 107 Airman certificate, is a ground school instructor, and has developed several small UAS courses. Brian has also provided support to tactical teams, forensic investigators, as well as search and rescue teams. He was the first certified extended visual line of sight check pilot in Canada, and the first in Canada to deploy UAS countermeasures at a VIP venue. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Brian talks about Blueforce Consulting and the use of countermeasures for security and public safety purposes. Interdrone 2018 is the largest commercial UAV and drone conference with nearly 3,500 attendees, 120 sessions, and more than 175 exhibitors. The show will be held in Las Vegas on September 5th through 7th. Make your plans now to attend. Use the code PARTNER and receive $100 off the purchase price of admission. Now, before we hear from Brian, I again want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to patreon.com/drone radio show to join the team. So let's learn how Counter UAS measures are enhancing security and public safety with Brian Fentiman. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Brian to introduce himself.
Okay, my name is Brian Fentiman. I am the Vice President and CTO of Blueforce UAV Consulting. I spent 34 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a telecommunications technologist. And the last 3 years of that service, I was the UAS and Counter UAS program coordinator for the province of British Columbia and a countermeasures specialist for the RCMP nationally. I hold a Diploma of Telecommunications Technology, so my background is a technical one, but I also supplied operational support to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for emergency response team callouts, search and rescue, and special investigations.
Brian, where are you based?
I'm based on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada.
Okay, great. Now, can you give us some background on Blueforce Consulting?
So Blueforce was formed in 2017. Myself and another RCMP member, retired Staff Sergeant David Dominy, he and I both retired at the same time and thought that we would take our experience with UAS and Counter UAS from the RCMP out into the corporate world and try to assist more agencies with getting their programs up and going and to help people understand what all the pitfalls of the C-sUAS industry are. So we both have a passion for it, and we both decided to start our own company. So it's the two of us as principals. And we assist companies with policy development of SOPs, handling regulatory issues. We also do ground school training and flight training. And then on the Counter UAS, a lot of it is consulting on custom solutions. So we evaluate systems. When we were with the RCMP, we held a number of tests that were from the industry. Companies would come demonstrate their equipment, and we've continued that on, doing research and visiting various companies to see what their latest products are. So we use that information to recommend solutions to our clients.
You're one of the few firms that I've seen that offers both UAS and counter UAS services. Typically, I see people specializing in one or the other. Is there much overlap between the two disciplines, or are they really separate and distinct services?
We do see a similarity, and that stems from our roots in law enforcement, where law enforcement needed to use UAS for gaining an advantage in security situations, whether that's an emergency response team call or something like that, to provide officer safety. So they needed to actually fly UAS, but at the same time, they also needed to protect their operations from nefarious pilots flying UAS. So that combination was just natural for us. We spent an equal amount of time on both sides. Those were the number one priorities through our experience with law enforcement. And of course, that expands to other security agencies as well. We found that common thread. So it stems from the same place, but it diverges soon after that as we have to look at what their unique needs are, both offensively and defensively.
What do you see as some of the key issues in the UAS and counter UAS fields?
A lot of agencies, everything from sporting event organizers to public safety, they're all starting to think about counter UAS, but they really have no idea where to place it with their traditional threats. And that even includes airports and things like that. The security part of those agencies always has a list of known threats. UAS is a new threat, the drone threat, and therefore they can't really quantify it, and they don't know where to stick it in their priority list. So they have a budget for their list of security priorities, and right now they just don't know where to plug the counter UAS into it. So we try to help them understand what the threat is. They see a lot of stories on the news overseas, more of the terrorist type attacks, and so they're not really sure how that translates domestically. So what we're able to do is offer them some insight into what's happening out there, what's being seen across the North America, really. And if they want to take it a step further, we can suggest a detection system or something that we can install for them so they can actually quantify what's out there. Because the first thing is they don't even know what's in their area until they put up a detection system. And then they're quite surprised by how many hits they get. And then, of course, the next step is to classify those detected drones as, are they threats? Are they just people that are clueless and flying in an area they shouldn't be flying in? Either way, it lets them know what their risks are.
Does counter UAS planning align well with the typical threat assessment methodology that's employed by today's security agencies, or does it require a whole new approach?
It's an interesting question. I think it's both, and I'll explain that a little. The traditional methods of assessing the risk and then processing it as to how you're going to mitigate that risk doesn't change. And in a lot of cases we find with UAS is that they try to reinvent the wheel when it's really not much different than most of the threats you already deal with. It's just coming from a different domain. It's coming from the sky. And traditionally, most ground-based entities are used to putting up perimeter fencing, putting in large vehicles to block roadways, things like that to counter any kind of threat, because that's where the threat is coming from, of course. With the UAS side of things, the thing that changes the dynamic is this wide open sky above them. And some of them have an issue getting their security people to switch over to that. For instance, we've provided security to large VIP events, that type of thing. And people that are on the ground that are watching for threats are looking traditionally from that 10 degrees above the horizon down, looking for threats all the time. They're just not trained to look up. And many times, the best detection systems we have for drones are people, but they're looking in the wrong place. And we found that our operators that were operating UAS for security events were usually the first ones to pick up nefarious drones or unauthorized drones because of that fact that they were trained to look in that other domain.
Is the technology capable of detecting drones and then determining which ones might have a malicious intent?
You can detect a drone that is not supposed to be there. So some equipment will allow you to whitelist your own drones if you're flying your own or known drones being used for the operation, and all others would then be considered to be bad actors, although you don't actually know whether that's a 16-year-old kid flying around taking pictures or whether it's somebody who intends on dropping some type of powder or spraying some poison over a crowd or something. So you really don't know what the intent is. So the main purpose of the system would be to identify that there's a drone that you don't expect to be there and pinpoint it as quickly as you can, and its telemetry as to how fast it's closing, what is its possible target it's closing on, and then send the appropriate resources or use the appropriate mitigation technology to stop that drone.
Fortunately, in North America, the violation of airspace has mostly been people not paying attention to the rules. But in other parts of the world, drones have been used in attacks. What have you seen that we may need to address in the future?
Well, certainly what we've seen from overseas with the terrorism attacks are the use of COTS off-the-shelf type drones being modified with very simple modifications that allow munitions to be dropped. Quite commonly, it's a modified rifle grenade that they can 3D print some aerodynamic fins for the back of and pour some metal to change the detonator on the front of it, and making these improvised bombs that they can drop. They can use the sophisticated cameras in order to basically calibrate it so they can use a crosshair and drop something. They're fairly crude, but I think the biggest impact, sure, they can actually hit a vehicle and take out a vehicle and have done so, but the majority of them probably miss their target, but it instills a great deal of fear in the troops because they don't know when it's coming, they can't hear it, it's not like a traditional attack. So that element of just being unnerved by a surprise from above, again, when you're trying to secure the ground, and it's not really at that level that the Air Force can detect it. So it is a new domain that is highly unnerving for the soldier.
Are you able to give us any indication as to how your Counter UAS business is doing relative to the commercial UAS consulting?
Well, that's another reason why we have that split business, is because initially it's very easy to get into the UAS consulting business in terms of the background that we have, that technical and law enforcement operational background. There's a lot of clients, corporate clients as well as public safety clients, that see that need, and we're able to fill that now. Meanwhile, we are still being held back on counter UAS solutions in terms of a lot of the regulatory changes that are required, both in the US and Canada. So we're working on that in the background while we continue to make sure we stay abreast of best-in-class solutions for counter UAS and sort of hold a lot of that in reserve, waiting for some of these regulatory changes to happen. Because right now there's very few clients that can actually use the majority of those tools other than detection. As soon as you move to mitigation, you're talking about Department of Homeland Security or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. You're talking about federal agencies that have that power. But there's legislation right now before the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate that they are looking at changing those laws, and in Canada as well.
Over the past year or so, it seems like public safety organizations have really started to warm up to using drones. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. We're starting to see that curve. There was early adopters, and a lot of them have kind of paved the way. And now there are solid use cases. We know initially a lot of it was police officers and other first responders that were hobbyists themselves, that flew drones, that had an aviation background. It was something interesting for them to do, and they knew that it would be a powerful tool for them. So it went from those early adopters who have now come up with proven use cases, shown the advantages of using UAS, that are now able to sell it to other departments. So things like the advent of programs for creating orthomosaics, photogrammetry, Pix4D, basically taking a crime scene or a collision scene where you can capture that entire scene as a 3D model or as an orthomosaic and have that preserved basically forever, as compared to getting a bunch of ground shots and then trying to sort that out and take using a total station to completely survey an accident scene while you close down the highway for 4 hours. So those kinds of things have shown great promise, and there are grants coming in now to allow law enforcement to buy equipment because the transportation industry sees how much money it can save when they don't have to shut the roads down that far or that long. And we also see the court system starting to say, hey, why don't we have UAS imagery for this crime? It's an outdoor crime. We've seen it before. The jury would get a much better idea of exactly what that scene looked like if you had that imagery. So we're getting to that point now where it's expected. And that's kind of nice to see.
Generally, when people seek your services, do they seem to know what they're looking for? Or are they still trying to figure out what they want or even what questions to ask?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. They know that other departments are using UAS and they know there's been some great success. They want to get into it, but they have no idea what the regulatory requirements are. They have no idea what the equipment requirements are, the training requirements, all those things. They really have no clue. And there is such a range of things like training options, where there are agencies that provide training. For instance, down in the US, you have your Part 107. And so you can take an online course, or you can just read the material yourself. You can write the Part 107 exam, and there you're a trained UAS pilot. But not for law enforcement, really, when you realize the public impact of the situations that they're normally using UAS in. They need training that's specific to what they're going to be doing. A lot of times it's in less than ideal conditions. It's at night, inclement weather. There's higher risks. There may be an armed and barricaded subject. Do you know what the effects of flying a UAS around somebody who's agitated, that type of thing? So there's a lot more in the training, which we sort of specialize in, a niche type of training that gives them what they need for the regulatory side, but also gives them information about the real world of public safety. And the same goes for our ground school course. Not many courses do you talk about, well, what information or in what situation would you need a warrant to gather that information? What are the privacy implications? Things that could get your evidence. It's great to gather it, but if it gets thrown out of court because it was obtained illegally, it's not much good to you. So there's a much broader range of things they need to consider in the public safety industry.
Is the training course on site of the client, or do they come to you? And do you put them through a variety of different scenarios so they can get a real-world experience of what they might face?
Yeah, we will go on site to the client, and we will do classroom sessions plus flight sessions, and it's customizable depending on what the client wants. If all they want to do is collision reconstruction, so it focuses more on aerial photography, that's one thing. But if the client is more a tactical response, then it would be a different type of training. So we kind of customize it to the particular client.
In your opinion, what do drones give a public safety organization that they wouldn't normally have?
I mean, obviously life-saving. If your particular department's role is also to do search and rescue, the ability to detect the heat signatures with a FLIR and find somebody, of course, human life, that's probably the highest value. And I think in terms of dollars, as I mentioned earlier, collision reconstruction, the ability to get a complete survey grade image of the crash scene and the reduction in time in having the roads shut down, there's a huge monetary impact. And while that may not be directly related to an advantage to law enforcement, overall it is in the larger scheme, because that also involves your local entities that are looking after infrastructure and things like that. And then there's the non-financial side of it, which is basically officer safety, where an emergency response team gains that eye-in-the-sky advantage during a tactical deployment, which definitely gives you the advantage. So those are sort of the big three that I see in public safety as having the biggest impact.
Now you're going to be speaking at Interdrone 2018 in September in Las Vegas. What will your session be about?
I'm going to focus on a 1-hour presentation on the countermeasures. So we'll go over all of the detection and mitigation technologies that are out there. And then because of my background, I'll lean a little heavily into the electronic countermeasures, so detection and mitigation, but really on how those electronic methods work. We see a lot of companies out there showing that you can hold up an electronic rifle and point it at the drone and direct it wherever you want. That's not really the case. There's a lot of information that people need to know in order to make good decisions on what equipment they should be purchasing. There's a lot of hype out there and a lot of, I shouldn't go so far as to say misleading, but I will, because there are products that are being sold that don't exactly do what some of the salespeople are telling you they can do. And we saw that a lot when they were trying to sell that equipment to us, and we were able to see through some of that. So what I want to do is present to people an overview so that they have enough knowledge going forward that at least they can dig a little deeper.
Who would benefit most by attending your session?
This particular session, I think, would be best suited for law enforcement professionals, public safety, and those concerned with security. So security for large corporations, infrastructure, that type of thing.
And what will they learn?
I think they will definitely walk away with an understanding of the differences between the various types of electronic countermeasures, that a jammer is not a jammer. There are several flavors, and there are risks and advantages to each type. So I think they will definitely walk away knowing what works, what doesn't work, and what you might want to spend a little bit more money on.
As you mentioned earlier, the regulations don't seem to have caught up with the use of countermeasures, and there are no standards. How do you think organizations and companies should work through this?
Well, there are a number of coalitions that have formed with volunteers and regulators, people that either work directly for or in conjunction with law firms, trying to get the industry to have a common voice in dealing with some of the legislative changes. So we're seeing that happening, which is great, and people can go online and check out some of those groups and see what work they're doing, see copies of the proposed laws that are in Congress right now. So I recommend following those groups so that you can stay on top of what's happening. And if you have, in some way, if you can assist them, definitely contact them. If your agency or company can join them as a member, that would be great. You just have to educate yourself. There's enough information out there, and probably too much information at the rate that UAS and Counter UAS technology changes. So being able to kind of filter out the noise and focus your efforts on where you need to go, I think is very important.
How does doing business in Canada and the United States compare, given the two markets and the regulatory requirements? Are there any differences or similarities?
They're at very similar points right now. And it's a bit of a leapfrog game as you see one country makes a gain in some changes, and then there's a delay, and then the other country kind of leapfrogs over them. But I think even worldwide, it's pretty similar everywhere. And that's because some of the traditional tools that have been used for jamming do have a lot of collateral damage, and agencies are reluctant to put those tools into the hands of people that could disrupt normal GPS signals for aircraft or communications via Wi-Fi, that type of thing, that they're at risk from indiscriminate jamming. So it's understandable that they've been reluctant to release the authority to use some of these tools. And I think that's where technology now is catching up, and there are better tools available. And that should allow the regulatory change to happen faster if we can show that there's less risk to some of the mitigations.
What have you learned since opening your doors in the past year about the field that you're in?
I would say that it's, like I mentioned previously, you have to watch out when you're looking for something. You have to be very careful that what the manufacturer or the salesperson is trying to sell you does what they say it does and is what you need. So sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction to, we need a solution. And so they've got some money, they're going to go out and get a solution. They know nothing about the technology, but they see a fancy demo and they're impressed by it and they spend their money. And then we see the demo by the same people and we go through it and start asking questions and find out that it's not quite what they say it is. For instance, it may be that their tool, some of the early ones, only worked with Wi-Fi controlled devices, of which there are very few left on the market. The Parrot AR is one of them. But for the majority of them, they're all using proprietary signals. That tool that they were offering to take care of drones was now only looking after a few percent of the market. So things like that surprised me, that a lot of this stuff was out there. But I guess it's not surprising if there's a need and people have a tool that they can kind of wrap in a shiny package and try and make some money off of that. So I would say to people, what I've learned over the last year is make sure if you don't know the technology, make sure you contact someone who does. So whether that's getting referrals from this company that's offering you something, find out who else has bought it, some other legitimate organization that can give you some real feedback. If they can't give you any references to check on, I'd be very wary.
When did you realize that you had the unique knowledge and expertise to form the consulting service in this industry?
Well, I think the fact that I was working for the RCMP and they had a need, and so I was given that task, that's what got me started on it. There was a legitimate need in law enforcement for some solutions, and so that was the impetus to get going. Being that it was my full-time job, most other agencies didn't have somebody working on one particular aspect as a full-time job. So I had the time to do the research. I also had the technical background to do the research. So I realized that there weren't many people that had that operational background, the technical background, and the UAS experience to actually pull that all together. So once I started going with that, of course, there were other agencies that came while I was still working saying, can you help us here? What is your suggestion, both on the UAS and counter UAS side? So I realized there was a big appetite out there and they didn't know where to go to. So it just seemed a natural to roll that into starting Blueforce.
Was it difficult transitioning from an employee to creating your own business?
Not as much as you'd think. The way that I worked before, because it was a new section and there weren't really any other people dealing with that with counter UAS, I pretty much was able to run with that and develop things much like I would in my own business. So having that freedom was excellent and an excellent starter to this. So other than becoming a businessman and wrapping your head around profits over delivering the safest solution you could, there was a bit of a mind shift there, but it's really difficult to actually shift that. And I don't think I'll ever completely shift over to being a profit-oriented businessman. I think it's getting the word out there and helping people and making sure they aren't falling into a trap. I think that's still what drives us.
And my final question, Brian, what message would you like to leave listeners about counter UAS measures?
I may have said a lot of things about what to watch out for and be careful in the industry and things like that, but there are a lot of nuggets out there. There is a lot of technology that's coming, that's ready for prime time, that is amazing. So don't get discouraged. Just have the right resources to make the right decisions and just dig a little deeper and you can find those solutions.
Are the things that you've mentioned far into the future, or will we see them soon?
I think they're pretty much ready for prime time now. They're things we've been watching for about a year now, from their promise to, in a prototype type package to actually seeing them roll off the assembly line for mass commercial sale. So I think we're at a very promising time right now for some excellent counter UAS solutions.
That's it for episode 172 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Brian Fentiman of Blueforce UAV Consulting. I want to thank Brian for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about Blueforce UAV Consulting or want to connect with Brian, check out the webpage at blueforceuav.com. And don't forget, you can visit with Brian at Interdrone 2018 on September 5th through 7th. Use the promo code PARTNER and get $100 off the cost of admission. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the costs of production. To donate, go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.